There's a particular kind of silence that fills a room when you've made a decision that will ruin your life. It's not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier. The weight of knowing you can't take it back. That the moment your finger hits that send button, everything changes. Waylon Park sat in a server room at Mount Massive Asylum on September 17th, 2013, listening to that silence while an email loaded on his screen. The message contained evidence of illegal human experimentation, torture disguised as psychiatric treatment, and deaths that would never be investigated. He'd addressed it to Miles Upshur, a freelance investigative journalist whose name he'd found through careful research, and in approximately 45 seconds, assuming the asylum security system didn't catch it first, that email would leave the facility's network and enter a world that had no idea what Murkoff Corporation was doing in the Colorado mountains. Waylon wasn't a hero. He was a software engineer who'd taken a 2-week contract because the pay was exceptional and the work seemed straightforward, maintaining digital infrastructure for a psychiatric facility. He had a wife named Lisa and 2 young sons waiting for him at home. He had a mortgage and car payments and the same concerns that occupy most people's minds when they're trying to build a stable life. What he didn't have was the ability to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. The morphogenic engine in the underground laboratory, the patients subjected to procedures that weren't treatment but systematic destruction. The thing they called the Walrider that existed somewhere between technology and nightmare. He'd stumbled onto classified files while performing routine server maintenance, and those files had shown him that Mount Massive wasn't a hospital. It was a weapons facility using human beings as raw materials. Get comfortable, let the outside world fade for a while, and let's walk through the story of what happened when one man's conscience collided with institutional evil, and what he had to survive when that collision destroyed everything he thought he knew about human nature. Murkoff Corporation didn't create monsters. They identified which ordinary people could become monsters under the right conditions, and then created those conditions with scientific precision. Chapter 1. Waylon Park arrived at Mount Massive Asylum 2 weeks before he sent the email that would trap him there. The facility sat in the Colorado mountains like a monument of architecture, all gray stone and narrow windows, built in the 1950s during an era when psychiatric hospitals were designed to contain rather than heal. The main building rose several stories, connected to additional wings that sprawled across the property in a layout that suggested expansion without planning, as though each generation of administrators had simply added onto whatever existed before without considering whether the result would be coherent. The drive up the mountain road gave no indication of what waited inside. Waylon had reviewed the facility's public information before accepting the contract. Mount Massive had a documented history as a psychiatric hospital that had closed in the early 1970s due to budget cuts and allegations of patient abuse. The facility sat abandoned for decades before Murkoff Corporation purchased it in 2009, ostensibly to conduct charitable psychiatric research. The company's press materials presented Mount Massive as a cutting-edge treatment facility where breakthrough therapies were being developed to help treatment-resistant patients. The reality, as Waylon would discover, was that Murkoff had chosen Mount Massive specifically because of its isolation, its existing infrastructure for containing people who couldn't leave, and its history of institutional secrecy that had normalized the idea that what happened inside psychiatric hospitals wasn't really anyone else's business. Waylon's initial impression of the facility was professional indifference. He'd worked technology contracts at hospitals, government buildings, and corporate campuses. Mount Massive seemed unremarkable. Security checkpoints that felt standard for a medical facility handling sensitive patient information. Staff who were polite but not particularly friendly. The institutional smell of industrial cleaning products over older odors that buildings accumulate over decades. He was given access credentials, shown to the server rooms where he'd be working, and provided basic orientation about facility layout and security protocols. The warning signs were subtle at first. Security was more extensive than seemed necessary for a psychiatric research facility. Waylon counted multiple checkpoints between public areas and patient wings, biometric scanners that required both keycard and fingerprint verification, and security personnel whose demeanor suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds rather than hospital security training. The surveillance infrastructure was excessive. Cameras in every corridor, audio monitoring in patient areas, and network traffic that indicated constant data transmission to external servers. For a facility that publicly emphasized patient privacy, Mount Massive had surveillance systems that would make intelligence agencies jealous. The staff maintained careful boundaries in their conversations. Waylon tried making casual conversation with other employees, asking about their work, their impressions of the facility, whether they enjoyed working for Murkoff. The responses were uniformly brief and nonspecific. People would acknowledge that the work was interesting and well compensated, but would deflect questions about specific research being conducted or details about patient populations. This wasn't the normal reticence of medical professionals protecting confidential information. This was the careful speech of people who'd been trained not to discuss their work, even in general terms. Waylon's access credentials gave him entry to areas most staff couldn't reach. As a software engineer responsible for maintaining servers, he needed physical access to equipment locations throughout the facility. This meant traveling through corridors that were supposed to be restricted, entering rooms where sensitive data was stored, and occasionally overhearing conversations or seeing documents that weren't meant for contract workers. In a properly managed facility, these exposures would be controlled through compartmentalization, ensuring that people only accessed exactly what they needed for specific tasks. But Mount Massive's infrastructure had been built across multiple decades by different administrations with varying security priorities. The result was a facility where someone with the right credentials could access far more than Murkoff probably intended. On his fourth day, Waylon performed maintenance in a server room adjacent to one of the underground laboratories. He was replacing failed hard drives in a storage array when he noticed network activity that didn't align with normal hospital operations. The data transfers were massive, gigabytes of video files, extensive medical records, and encrypted communications being sent to external locations that his brief investigation suggested were Murkoff facilities in other states and possibly other countries. This wasn't unusual for a research hospital. Institutions regularly shared data. What was unusual was the volume and the fact that much of it was being transmitted during overnight hours when staff presence was minimal, suggesting deliberate attempts to avoid observation. Waylon's training included basic information security practices. He understood that investigating unusual network activity beyond his specific job responsibilities was both ethically questionable and potentially dangerous to his continued employment. He also understood that if something genuinely problematic was happening, looking the other way made him complicit. He told himself he was simply being thorough, checking whether the network activity represented a security vulnerability that Murkoff's IT department needed to address. This rationalization let him begin examining files that he technically had access to, but no business opening. The first document he found was a patient transfer log. Mount Massive had received 37 patients in the previous 6 months from various psychiatric institutions, prisons, and what the log described as voluntary community intake. The patients' names were redacted, replaced with alphanumeric designations. Their diagnoses were listed: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe PTSD, dissociative identity disorder, but with notations that were purely clinical without the humanizing details that normally accompany medical records. These weren't people being treated. These were specimens being cataloged. The transfer log included a section titled Morphogenic Engine Compatibility Assessment. Each patient had been evaluated for characteristics described in language that blended psychiatry with something else: high suggestibility index, trauma substrate depth, ego dissolution threshold, reality testing impairment grade. Waylon had no psychiatric training, but he understood data structures and what they revealed about institutional priorities. These assessments weren't measuring patients' treatment needs. They were measuring patients' suitability for something that required breaking them. He found video files next, security footage from areas designated as therapy rooms, but which looked more like interrogation cells: concrete walls, restraint chairs, monitoring equipment. The footage showed patients being subjected to procedures that didn't resemble any psychiatric treatment Waylon had heard of: prolonged sensory deprivation, extended physical restraint, exposure to audio and visual stimuli that patients clearly found distressing, and in several cases something that looked like torture: patients screaming while staff in protective equipment administered procedures that the camera angles didn't quite capture, but which left subjects visibly traumatized afterward. One video stayed with him: a patient, designation P42, strapped into a chair with some kind of apparatus on his head, wires and sensors connected to equipment that hummed with electrical activity. The patient was conscious, eyes wide and rolling, making sounds that were barely human. A technician adjusted settings on the equipment while another took notes on a clipboard. The procedure continued for 17 minutes of footage. When it ended and the restraints were released, the patient didn't move. He sat in the chair, staring at nothing, while staff discussed whether the session had achieved desired neurological patterns. They were talking about a human being the way mechanics discuss whether an engine is properly tuned. Waylon sat in the server room, watching this footage on a screen that wasn't meant for video playback, feeling something fundamental shift in his understanding of what he'd agreed to be part of. He could tell himself that this was classified government research, that there were probably legitimate reasons for procedures that looked disturbing to untrained observers, that people smarter and more informed than him had approved these protocols. He could finish his contract, take his substantial paycheck, and go home to his family without ever mentioning what he'd seen. Or he could acknowledge that what he was watching was human beings being tortured in a facility that was supposed to help them, funded by a corporation that had unlimited resources and no meaningful oversight, and that if he didn't do something, he would spend the rest of his life knowing he'd been complicit in atrocities because speaking up was inconvenient. The decision wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a moment of heroic resolve. It was simply Waylon recognizing that he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he stayed silent, and that any consequences he faced would be preferable to the alternative of carrying this knowledge alone. He spent the next 10 days gathering evidence. He copied files to encrypted drives small enough to conceal on his person. He documented network traffic patterns and server locations where additional evidence might be stored. He took photographs of equipment and facility layouts using his phone's camera, always careful to avoid security cameras and to maintain the appearance of normal work routine. And he researched journalists who might be willing to investigate a story this dangerous. Miles Upsher's name appeared in several articles about corporate malfeasance and government corruption. He was a freelance investigative journalist with a reputation for pursuing stories that mainstream media outlets considered too risky or too expensive. His work had exposed defense contractor fraud, pharmaceutical company misconduct, and intelligence agency overreach. If anyone would take Waylon's evidence seriously and have the resources to investigate further, Miles Upshur seemed like the best option. Waylon drafted the email carefully. He included enough detail to make clear that this wasn't conspiracy theory or attention-seeking fabrication. He attached selected documents that demonstrated the scope of what was happening without revealing so much that Murkoff's security systems would automatically flag the transmission. He provided his contact information but made clear that time was critical. If Murkoff discovered the leak, both the evidence and the whistleblower would disappear. On September 17, 2013, with 3 days remaining in his contract, Waylon returned to the server room where he'd first discovered the patient transfer logs. He accessed an external email client through a proxy that would disguise the message's origin, at least temporarily. He attached the compressed file containing evidence of Murkoff's experiments. He typed Miles Upshur's email address, and he sent the message that would bring Miles Upshur to Mount Massive Asylum and trap Waylon Park in hell. The email took 47 seconds to send. In that brief window, Waylon experienced the full weight of what he'd done. If this worked, if Miles investigated and published the story, Murkoff Corporation would face legal and public relations catastrophe. The people responsible would be held accountable. The patients still trapped in Mount Massive's underground labs might be rescued, and Waylon would be protected as a whistleblower whose actions served the public interest. If it didn't work, if Murkoff discovered the leak before Miles could act, then Waylon had just signed his own death warrant. The confirmation message appeared on screen. The email sent successfully. Waylon cleared his browser history, wiped the proxy logs, and closed the terminal. He sat in the server room's fluorescent silence, listening to the hum of cooling fans and feeling his heart rate slowly return to normal. He'd done it. The evidence was out. Whatever happened next, at least he'd tried. He returned to his assigned work, finished the day's maintenance tasks, and logged out of the facility systems at his normal time. He walked through security checkpoints with the same casual demeanor he'd maintained throughout his contract. He drove down the mountain road toward the hotel where he was staying, watching Mount Massive disappear in his rearview mirror, and allowed himself to believe that he might actually get away with it. He was wrong. Somewhere in Murkoff's security infrastructure, automated systems designed to monitor all network traffic were already analyzing the unusual data transmission from the server room. Algorithms were comparing the email's content against classified documents and flagging matches that indicated potential security breach. And security personnel were being notified that someone had just attempted to leak evidence of Mount Massive's real purpose. Waylon made it to his hotel. He packed his belongings, planning to check out early and drive home rather than wait for his contract's official end date. He told himself that leaving immediately was just caution, not paranoia. He called his wife and told her he'd be home by morning, hearing her voice and his sons in the background and feeling the overwhelming need to get back to them as quickly as possible. He fell asleep that night believing he'd successfully exposed Murkoff Corporation and would soon be safe at home, protected by whistleblower statutes and public attention. He woke to someone breaking down his hotel room door. Chapter 2. The Punishment. The men who entered Waylon's hotel room weren't police and didn't pretend to be. They wore tactical gear without insignia, black uniforms, body armor, weapons holstered but visible. They moved with military efficiency, securing the room in seconds, neutralizing Waylon's ability to resist or flee before he'd fully processed what was happening. One grabbed his phone and crushed it underfoot. Another collected his laptop and the encrypted drives he'd hidden in his luggage. A third injected something into Waylon's arm that made his vision swim and his limbs turn unresponsive. They didn't speak except to coordinate their actions. No one read him rights or explained what was happening. They simply processed him like problematic cargo that needed to be secured and transported. Waylon tried to fight, tried to speak, tried to do anything that would establish his humanity and his rights. The sedative in his system made resistance impossible. He felt himself being lifted, carried, placed into a vehicle. He heard engine noise and felt motion, and then the drug pulled him under entirely, consciousness dissolving into chemical darkness. When he woke, he was back at Mount Massive Asylum. He was in a cell, concrete walls, a metal bed frame without mattress, a toilet without privacy partition, and a heavy door with a small observation window. He was wearing patient clothing, thin cotton shirt and pants, no shoes, nothing that could be used as a weapon or tool. His head throbbed, where something had been attached to his skull during the period he couldn't remember. He reached up and felt metal and glass, night vision goggles that had been mounted directly onto his head, secured with some kind of frame that bit into skin and bone. The realization of what had happened came in stages. Murkoff had caught him. They'd retrieved the evidence he'd copied, and rather than simply killing him or delivering him to law enforcement, they'd chosen a different punishment. They were going to make him a patient. The cell door opened. A man entered wearing a suit and the expression of someone who dealt with problems like Waylon many times before. He introduced himself as Jeremy Blair, Executive Vice President at Murkoff Corporation. His voice carried the practiced calm of someone accustomed to delivering bad news while maintaining plausible deniability. Blair explained Waylon's situation with corporate efficiency. The email to Miles Upshur had been intercepted and deleted from external servers before the journalist could access it. The evidence Waylon had gathered had been recovered and would be destroyed. Waylon's employment with Murkoff was terminated, though official records would show he'd completed his contract without incident. His wife and children would be told he'd died in a car accident, with appropriate death benefits provided to ensure they didn't investigate further or pursue legal action. Waylon tried to speak, to argue, to threaten legal consequences. Blair dismissed each attempt with the same corporate calm. There would be no legal consequences because Waylon Park no longer legally existed. The man who'd sent that email had died in a convenient traffic accident. The person in this cell was just another psychiatric patient admitted to Mount Massive for treatment of delusional disorder and paranoid schizophrenia, diagnoses that would conveniently explain any claims he might make about being held against his will. This was the punishment Murkoff reserved for internal threats that couldn't be quietly eliminated. They would commit Waylon to the asylum as a patient, subject him to whatever broke first, his mind or his willingness to stay silent, and if he somehow survived, he'd emerge so psychologically destroyed that no one would believe anything he said. If he didn't survive, well, psychiatric patients died sometimes. Tragic, but not particularly suspicious. Blair left without waiting for response. The cell door closed, and Waylon Park, software engineer, husband, father, and whistleblower, disappeared into Mount Massive's patient population. The first hours were the worst. Waylon wasn't mentally ill, wasn't experiencing symptoms that would have led someone to seek psychiatric treatment voluntarily. He had perfect clarity about who he was and what had happened. This made his imprisonment feel like being buried alive, fully conscious, fully aware, and completely powerless to escape, or even to convince anyone that he shouldn't be there. The psychiatric evaluation that followed was theater designed to justify predetermined conclusions. A doctor asked questions clearly calibrated to generate responses that could be recorded as evidence of mental illness. Waylon's accurate explanations that he was a software engineer who discovered illegal experiments and been imprisoned to silence him were documented as paranoid delusions about being persecuted by powerful organizations. His distress at being separated from his family was recorded as emotional instability. His anger at the injustice of his situation was noted as potential for violence requiring pharmaceutical management. The doctor prescribed medications that Waylon refused to take. This refusal was documented as lack of insight into his condition and resistance to treatment, further evidence of mental illness requiring involuntary intervention. When he continued refusing, orderlies held him down while medications were administered by injection. The drugs weren't antipsychotics meant to treat symptoms Waylon didn't have. They were chemical restraints designed to make him manageable, sedatives that left him foggy and compliant, compounds that disrupted clear thinking and made sustained resistance difficult. He spent days in a pharmaceutical haze, time losing meaning. His certainty about what was real gradually corroded by isolation and chemical manipulation. He met other patients during brief periods when he was allowed into common areas. Some were genuinely mentally ill, experiencing symptoms that had led to their admission. Others, Waylon suspected, were like him, people who'd become problems for Murkoff and been disappeared into the asylum's population. It was impossible to know for certain. The medications and the environment made everyone seem at least partially detached from reality. Maybe they were victims of corporate retaliation. Maybe they were patients experiencing paranoid delusions who'd incorporated Murkoff into their belief systems. Maybe both were true. Maybe Murkoff deliberately admitted genuinely mentally ill patients alongside forcibly committed threats, making it impossible to distinguish legitimate psychiatric cases from political prisoners. Waylon learned the asylum's social dynamics through observation and painful experience. There were hierarchies among patients based on factors he couldn't quite identify. Some patients were given privileges and better treatment. Others were targeted by staff for particular attention that looked more like punishment than care. There were areas of the facility that patients whispered about, but that Waylon hadn't seen. Underground laboratories, experimental wings, places where things happened that made even the asylum's public horrors seem tolerable by comparison. And there were the variants. Mount Massive's patient population included people who'd been subjected to procedures that had left them profoundly changed. They weren't typical psychiatric patients. They were something else. Humans whose minds had been deliberately broken and rebuilt into shapes that served Murkoff's purposes. Some were violent in ways that seemed strategic rather than symptoms of illness. Others demonstrated psychological profiles that suggested they'd been programmed with specific behaviors and responses. The staff called them ex-patients, or sometimes variants, as though acknowledging they were no longer quite the same species as the people they'd been before the morphogenic engine rewrote their neurological architecture. Waylon avoided the variants when possible and defended himself when it wasn't. He was desperate to maintain his sense of self against the pharmaceutical fog, the institutional gaslighting, and the environmental horror of being trapped among people who'd been destroyed by the same systems currently working on him. He clung to memories of his wife and sons, repeating their names like prayers, using thoughts of them as anchors to prevent his identity from dissolving entirely. He'd been a patient for approximately 2 weeks when everything changed. The asylum's power failed during the night, plunging the facility into darkness broken only by emergency lighting. The cell doors, which were electronically controlled, unlocked automatically as a safety feature. Waylon heard screaming and running footsteps, sounds of violence echoing through corridors, and something else, a high-pitched tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, making his teeth ache and his night vision goggles flicker with interference. He emerged cautiously from his cell, using the night vision goggles that had been such a visible mark of his prisoner status to navigate the darkened corridors. The scene was chaos. Patients flooded the hallways, some fleeing in terror, others pursuing staff with improvised weapons and expressions that suggested this wasn't random violence but long-awaited revenge. The variants moved with disturbing purpose, as though this moment was what they'd been built for. Waylon saw an orderly torn apart by multiple patients. He saw a doctor dragged into a room while begging for mercy that wouldn't come. He saw evidence of institutional cruelty inscribed on the asylum itself, blood stains on walls that suggested this wasn't the first outbreak, restraint systems that looked more like medieval torture equipment than medical devices, and rooms whose purposes he couldn't identify but which radiated the psychic residue of suffering. He needed to escape. The asylum had become a war zone, and remaining meant dying either at the hands of the variants, the staff defending themselves, or whatever had caused the power failure and was generating that penetrating high-frequency sound. He navigated by instinct and desperate logic, moving away from sounds of violence, searching for exits that would lead out of the facility entirely. He found stairs leading down instead of up. Following them felt wrong, but the alternative routes were blocked by fire or fighting or structural collapse. He descended into Mount Massive's underground sections, areas he'd been briefly exposed to during his software work, but which now seemed to extend far deeper than he'd realized. This was where the real work had been conducted. The upper levels of Mount Massive were theater, patient wards, and therapy rooms that could be shown to inspectors or used for conventional psychiatric care. The underground laboratories were where Murkoff's actual research happened, where the morphogenic engine lived, where patients were transformed into variants through procedures that would never survive ethical review. The morphogenic engine dominated the space, a massive apparatus combining medical equipment, computer systems, and something that looked almost organic. Cables and tubes connected it to multiple chambers where patients could be secured and subjected to whatever process the engine represented. The air smelled of ozone and something chemical that made Waylon's eyes water. Emergency lighting cast everything in red shadows that turned the laboratory into something from nightmare architecture, and there was a patient still connected to the engine. A man suspended in what looked like an induced coma state, his body kept alive by machines, while his mind experienced whatever the engine forced into it. Documents scattered nearby identified him as Billy Hope, the morphogenic engine's only successful subject, the host for something called the Walrider that existed in the space between biology and technology. Waylon didn't understand what he was looking at, but he understood that this was the horror at Mount Massive's center. This was what happened to patients who survived the preliminary procedures. They became biological components in systems that shouldn't exist, their consciousness trapped in engineered dream states while their bodies served as hosts for whatever Murkoff was creating. He heard movement behind him and turned to see Miles Upshur, stumbling into the laboratory, covered in blood, clutching a camera, looking like he'd fought through every circle of hell to get here. Waylon recognized him from photographs he'd found during his research, the journalist he'd tried to contact, who'd somehow received the evidence despite Murkoff's efforts to intercept it, who'd come to Mount Massive to investigate and gotten trapped in the same nightmare. They didn't have time for explanations. Miles moved toward the morphogenic engine with a determination that suggested he understood what needed to happen. He was going to unplug Billy Hope, end the experiment, stop the Walrider. Waylon wanted to warn him, to explain that Jeremy Blair was hunting them both, that Murkoff's security forces would be converging on this location. But before he could speak, Blair appeared with armed personnel, ordering them to stop Miles before he could sabotage years of research. What happened next was violence compressed into seconds. Miles unplugged the engine. Billy Hope's body went into catastrophic failure, alarms screaming as life support systems registered irreversible decline, and something emerged from the machinery, a form made of shadow and movement, impossible to focus on directly, creating the impression of immense swarm intelligence. The Walrider, no longer anchored to its host, no longer constrained by the engine's containment protocols. It killed Blair first. Waylon saw the executive's body torn apart by forces that left no corpse, just components scattered across the laboratory floor. The security personnel opened fire, their weapons utterly ineffective against something that wasn't solid matter in any conventional sense. The Walrider moved through them like wind through grass, and they died screaming. Miles collapsed, wounded by gunfire during the chaos. Waylon moved to help him, but Miles pushed him away, gesturing toward the exit. His camera lay nearby, still recording, documenting everything that had happened. Miles knew he was dying, but he needed the footage to survive him, needed someone to carry the evidence out of Mount Massive so that everything he'd witnessed wouldn't die with him. Waylon grabbed the camera and ran. Behind him, the Walrider converged on Miles's body. He heard sounds that didn't make sense, not consumption, but something else, some form of integration. And then silence broken only by alarms and the groaning of the facility's damaged infrastructure. He ran through corridors that felt less like built spaces and more like organic passages, the asylum's architecture warping around him in ways that shouldn't be possible. He saw variants hunting remaining staff. He saw evidence of things that had happened during the outbreak, bodies positioned in ways that suggested ritual or message rather than simple violence, rooms that looked like they'd been sites of pitched warfare, and areas where the building itself seemed damaged by forces that normal violence couldn't explain. He found stairs leading up. He climbed past the underground laboratories, past the patient wards, past the administrative levels where he'd worked before his arrest. He emerged into sections of the asylum he'd never accessed, older wings that looked like they belonged to Mount Massive's original era, places that had been closed for decades but which still bore evidence of the institutional horrors that had made the facility notorious in the first place. This was where he encountered the worst of Mount Massive's patient population, the variants who'd been subjected to the morphogenic engine's procedures, who'd survived with their bodies intact but their minds rebuilt into architectures that served purposes Waylon couldn't comprehend. They moved through the asylum like they owned it, like this outbreak was liberation rather than catastrophe. Some ignored him, others pursued him with hunger that wasn't entirely physical. And then there was Eddie Gluskin, the groom, the patient whose particular pathology would teach Waylon exactly how sophisticated human evil could become when given institutional support and opportunity. But we're not there yet. First, we need to understand what Waylon had survived already, what he'd witnessed, and what he was carrying with him as he fled deeper into Mount Massive's halls, away from the underground laboratories where the Walrider had been born, away from the administrative wing where Jeremy Blair's scattered remains were cooling, and toward horrors that were somehow worse because they were purely human. Chapter 3: The Vocational Block. The sign above the entrance read, "Vocational Block," in letters that might have been cheerful once, back when Mount Massive genuinely tried to rehabilitate patients through occupational therapy. Now the words felt like mockery, a promise of useful work that had been perverted into something that served only to remind the variants trapped here that they'd once been people with purposes beyond survival and suffering. Waylon entered the vocational block because all other routes had been cut off. Fire blocked the main corridors. Structural collapse had sealed the eastern wing, and behind him, he could hear the variants from the patient ward spreading through the facility like infection, their voices echoing off concrete walls in sounds that weren't quite language anymore. The vocational block's entrance stood open, lit by emergency lighting that flickered in rhythms suggesting failing electrical systems. Every instinct told him not to enter. Every alternative was worse. The block had been designed as workshops where patients could learn practical skills, woodworking, metalworking, basic manufacturing tasks that might help them find employment after discharge. The equipment remained: industrial saws, welding stations, heavy machinery that should have been secured, but which sat exposed and accessible. The space felt like a factory that had been abandoned mid-shift, tools left where workers had dropped them, projects half-finished on workbenches, the air still carrying the smell of cut wood and machine oil. But the projects on the workbenches weren't the kind assigned by occupational therapists. They were bodies, or pieces of bodies, arranged with care that suggested aesthetic consideration rather than disposal. Some had been modified, surgical alterations performed with enthusiasm that vastly exceeded skill. Others were displayed like mannequins, dressed in makeshift clothing, positioned in tableaux that would have been domestic if the figures weren't corpses. Waylon moved through the workshop area, trying to process what he was seeing, without letting it overwhelm his ability to function. These bodies were patients, he realized, people who'd been trapped in Mount Massive during the outbreak and had encountered whatever lived in the vocational block. They'd been killed, but that wasn't sufficient. They'd been transformed into something else, components in a vision that belonged to someone whose understanding of humanity had been catastrophically damaged. Wedding music played from speakers mounted throughout the block. Not recorded music, but a live performance. Someone singing along to a scratched record, voice shifting between tender crooning and manic laughter. The song was "I Want a Girl," an old-fashioned tune about romantic love and domestic bliss. Hearing it in this context, surrounded by corpses arranged like wedding decorations, transformed nostalgia into something nauseating. Waylon tried to move quietly, using the workshop's layout for cover, staying low behind workbenches and equipment. He could hear movement in other areas of the block, someone working, the sounds of sawing and hammering and effort, and he could hear talking, a man's voice speaking to himself or to people who weren't there, alternating between gentleness and rage so quickly that tracking his emotional state was impossible. Not right, not right at all. You said you loved me. You said you'd be faithful, but you're just like all the others, aren't you? Just another whore who can't keep her legs closed. The voice grew closer. Waylon pressed himself into a gap between two large machines, trying to become invisible. Through the narrow space, he saw the speaker emerge into the workshop area. Eddie Gluskin was a tall man in his 30s, well-built, wearing blood-stained clothing that might have been patient garb, but which he'd modified into something resembling formal wear. A shirt with the sleeves rolled up, pants that he'd belted with improvised materials. His face would have been handsome in a different context, features that suggested he'd been attractive before whatever happened to him at Mount Massive, but his expression ruined any aesthetic appeal, eyes that shifted between focused intensity and complete disconnection. mouth moving through smiles and snarls like someone cycling through emotions. He'd learned to perform, but didn't actually feel. He was dragging a body, another patient, this one still barely alive, making sounds that were mostly pain. Eddie pulled him to a workbench and lifted him onto it with strength that suggested adrenaline or madness overriding normal physical limitations. He secured the patient with restraints, speaking soothingly the entire time. "Don't worry, darling. I know you're scared, but that's natural. Every bride gets nervous before the wedding, but I promise I'll be gentle. Well, as gentle as I can be, while making sure you're perfect. You understand, don't you? I can't marry someone who isn't perfect. My bride needs to be flawless, completely pure, the kind of woman a man can build a family with." The patient tried to speak, tried to explain that he wasn't a woman, that whatever Eddie was planning wasn't what he thought. Eddie placed a hand over his mouth, shushing him like a parent calming an anxious child. I know, you're confused, but that's because you don't understand yet. See, the problem with the women they've brought me so far is that they're all flawed. They have histories, they've been with other men, they're damaged goods, ruined before I even had a chance to make them mine. But you can be different. I can fix you. I can make you into exactly what I need. Eddie reached for a surgical saw lying on the workbench. The tool wasn't medical equipment, but something from the workshop, designed for cutting wood, not flesh. The patient's sounds became screaming. Eddie's expression remained tender, like he was performing an act of love rather than torture. Waylon forced himself to move, to look away, to keep navigating toward whatever exit might exist at the vocational block's far end. He couldn't help the patient strapped to Eddie's table. Intervening would only create two victims instead of one. The calculation was brutal, but survival required accepting brutal mathematics. He found stairs leading to the block's upper level, a section that had served as offices and storage for the occupational therapy program. The area was less industrialized than the workshop floor, more conventional, institutional architecture, but it had been modified extensively. The offices had been converted into something resembling living quarters, decorated with materials scavenged from throughout the asylum. Mannequins stood in corners, dressed in patient clothing and arranged in domestic poses, sitting at tables, standing by windows, positioned like family photographs brought to three-dimensional life. One room had been transformed into a grotesque parody of a bridal suite. White fabric draped from the ceiling, candles burned on every surface, their wax dripping down walls in cascades that looked organic. A dress hung from a clothing rack, something Eddie had apparently constructed from bed sheets and materials whose origins Waylon didn't want to consider. And on a bed made from pushed-together mattresses, there were more bodies, brides who hadn't met Eddie's standards, who'd been found wanting, who'd paid for their imperfection with mutilation and death. Waylon searched the rooms for supplies, anything that might help him escape or defend himself. He found medical supplies that Eddie had apparently stolen from the asylum's infirmary, tools that suggested Eddie had been preparing for his work long before the outbreak, and documents that revealed Eddie Gluskin's history before Mount Massive. The files were patient records, Eddie's admission documents, psychiatric evaluations, incident reports. Waylon read them quickly, his night vision goggles casting everything in green monochrome that made the handwritten notes look like they'd been written in poison. Eddie Gluskin had been admitted to Mount Massive 4 years earlier following arrest for assault and attempted murder of a woman he'd been dating. The arrest investigation revealed a pattern. Multiple women with restraining orders against him, allegations of stalking and violence, evidence that Eddie's romantic obsessions turned dangerous when women tried to leave. The The psychiatric evaluation diagnosed him with severe personality pathology, borderline features, narcissistic traits, possible emerging psychosis with paranoid and grandiose elements. But the evaluation also revealed something else. Eddie had been severely sexually abused as a child by his father and uncle, trauma that had lasted years and which Eddie's mind had apparently processed by developing intense hatred of women combined with obsessive idealization of marriage and family. His psychology had collapsed the concepts of intimacy, violence, and control into a single fused complex where love meant ownership and rejection meant betrayal requiring punishment. The standard of care for someone with Eddie's history would have been trauma-focused therapy, medications to manage his mood instability and emerging psychotic symptoms, and long-term treatment aimed at helping him develop healthier relationship patterns. Mount Massive had provided something different. The record showed Eddie had been designated a high-priority candidate for the Morphogenic Engine project. His existing psychopathology made him suitable for procedures designed to amplify specific psychological features and suppress others. They'd subjected him to the engine repeatedly over 4 years, each session pushing his already damaged psyche further toward complete fracture. The goal, according to notes from Dr. Wernicke and other researchers, was to create a subject whose obsessive features could be directed toward specific targets, whose capacity for violence was enhanced rather than treated, whose reality testing was impaired just enough to make him suggestible, but not so much that he became non-functional. Eddie Gluskin had been deliberately transformed from a mentally ill patient who might have been treatable into a monster who experienced his own monstrosity as romantic destiny. Murkoff hadn't cured his pathology. They'd weaponized it. Waylon put the files down, feeling nauseous. Every variant he'd encountered in Mount Massive represented the same pattern. People who'd entered with psychiatric conditions that made them vulnerable were subjected to procedures that amplified their worst features, while destroying their capacity for self-regulation. The asylum wasn't creating new psychologies from scratch. It was finding existing damage and making it deeper, wider, more elaborate until patients became living embodiments of specific psychiatric nightmares. He heard Eddie's voice calling from somewhere below, singing along to the wedding music that continued playing through the block speaker system. The words were romantic, promises of eternal devotion, visions of domestic happiness. Eddie sang them with genuine emotion, like he believed every word, like his murdered brides were evidence of love rather than its opposite. Waylon needed to leave. Every moment in the vocational block increased the probability of Eddie discovering him. And Eddie's treatment of his previous victims made clear what would happen if he was caught. He found a door leading to a maintenance corridor, a narrow passage that connected the vocational block to other sections of the asylum. The corridor was dark, even with night vision, barely wide enough to navigate, and felt like traveling through the facility's intestines. He emerged into what looked like an older section of Mount Massive, architecture that predated the 1950s renovation, original construction from when the asylum was first built. The walls were exposed brick, the floors were worn stone, and everything felt colder, as though this area wasn't properly heated or hadn't been accessed in decades. This was when Eddie found him. Waylon didn't hear him approach. One moment he was alone in the corridor, the next Eddie Gluskin was behind him, strong arms wrapping around his chest and pinning his own arms to his sides. Eddie's voice was gentle against his ear. "There you are, darling. I've been looking everywhere for you. Did you really think you could hide from me in my own home? This is where we're going to build our life together. This is where our story begins." Waylon fought, trying to break Eddie's grip, But the man was stronger and had leverage. Eddie dragged him back through the maintenance corridor, back into the vocational block, speaking the entire time in that tender voice that made everything worse. I know you're scared. That's natural. You don't understand yet what this means, what we're going to mean to each other. But I'll teach you. I'll show you how to be the perfect wife. And once you understand, once I've fixed all the little imperfections, we'll be so happy together, just like I've always dreamed. They reached the workshop floor. Eddie forced Waylon toward a table that had been prepared, restraints already in place, surgical tools arranged nearby, everything ready for whatever procedure Eddie believed would transform his victim into the bride he'd been searching for. Waylon was strapped down, Eddie's hands efficient with the restraints, muscle memory from having done this many times before. He tried to speak, to reason, to explain that he had a wife and children waiting for him. Eddie put a finger to his lips. Don't ruin this moment with lies. I know you've been with other men, I can tell, but that's okay. I can fix that. I can make you pure again. It's going to hurt. I won't lie to you, darling. It's going to hurt more than anything you've ever experienced. But pain is how we purify. Pain is how we burn away all the damage and leave only the perfect bride I know is hiding inside you. Eddie reached for the surgical saw. Waylon pulled against the restraints hard enough to damage his wrists, panic overriding any concern for injury. The saw's blade caught the emergency lighting, metal gleaming against the workshop's darkness. Eddie tested its weight, smiled with satisfaction, and moved toward the table. The explosion saved Waylon's life. Somewhere in Mount Massive's underground sections, something detonated, possibly a gas line ignited by fire, possibly deliberate sabotage by survivors trying to stop the Walrider spread. The blast was powerful enough to shake the entire facility, bringing down sections of ceiling and causing electrical systems to fail completely. The workshop plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by the faint green glow of night vision goggles. The structural damage dislodged something above Eddie's position, a heavy piece of machinery that fell from its mounting and crashed down onto the workbench, missing Eddie by inches but destroying the table and breaking Waylon's restraints. Eddie stumbled backward, startled, and Waylon rolled off the collapsing table and ran. He didn't look back. He didn't try to see whether Eddie was injured or whether he'd pursue. He simply ran through the workshop, past the bodies Eddie had arranged like wedding decorations, past the bride suite with its candles and corpses, through the maintenance corridor, and into the older asylum sections where brick and stone gave way to metal and concrete. Behind him, Eddie's voice echoed through the vocational block, no longer tender, now raw with rage and betrayal. You can't leave me. No one leaves me. I'll find you. I'll find you, and I'll make you perfect, even if I have to cut away everything that makes you think you can reject me. The voice faded as Waylon put distance between himself and the block. He was bleeding from where the restraints had cut into his wrists. His night vision goggles were cracked, the display flickering intermittently, but he was alive. He'd escaped Eddie Gluskin's operating table and the fate that had consumed Eddie's previous victims. He allowed himself 3 seconds of relief, then he focused on the only thing that mattered, finding a way out of Mount Massive before something else killed him. Chapter 4: The Architecture of Institutional Madness. The sections of Mount Massive that Waylon navigated now belonged to the asylum's original era, built in the late 19th century, when psychiatric treatment meant containment and psychiatric hospitals were designed primarily to keep patients separated from society rather than to heal them. The architecture reflected those priorities: narrow corridors with heavy doors that could be locked from outside, Small cells with observation windows that allowed staff to monitor patients without entering. Common areas designed to hold large populations in minimal space. These older sections should have been abandoned, consigned to the facility's historical footprint without active use. But as Waylon moved through them, he found evidence that Murkoff had been utilizing these spaces for purposes the corporation's public-facing documentation never acknowledged. Storage rooms filled with files documenting decades of patients. Equipment that looked medical, but whose purposes Waylon couldn't identify. And laboratories, not the modern underground facilities where the morphogenic engine lived, but older experimental spaces where previous generations had conducted their own forms of psychiatric research. Mount Massive's history was written in these rooms. Waylon found records from the 1950s showing the asylum's participation in government-funded psychiatric research during the Cold War era. Experiments with electroshock therapy administered at voltages that caused brain damage. Insulin coma therapy that put patients into sustained, unconscious states. Surgical procedures, lobotomies, and other interventions that permanently altered patients' cognitive abilities. The files describe these procedures with clinical detachment. Patients identified by numbers, outcomes measured in behavioral changes, deaths noted without apparent concern. Reading them, Waylon understood that Mount Massive's collaboration with Murkoff Corporation wasn't aberration but continuation. The facility had always been a place where vulnerable people were subjected to experimental procedures by researchers who viewed psychiatric patients as acceptable research subjects. The ethics had changed over the decades. The techniques had become more sophisticated. But the fundamental dynamic remained identical. Institutional authority combined with captive population produced conditions where researchers could pursue projects that would be rejected anywhere with meaningful oversight. Waylon found evidence that some patients had recognized what was happening and had tried to resist. Notes written on walls in what might have been blood, scratched messages that spoke of doctors who were actually torturers, desperate pleas for help that had gone unanswered because anyone reading them would have dismissed the writers as mentally ill patients, experiencing paranoid delusions. How many people had been trapped in Mount Massive over the decades? How many had understood that they were being harmed rather than helped? And how many had died without ever being believed? The thought made Waylon feel sick. He was only here because he'd tried to expose one iteration of institutional abuse. The abuse itself had roots going back generations, protected by the same dynamics that made his own imprisonment possible. The assumption that psychiatric patients couldn't be reliable narrators of their own experiences. He passed through what had been hydrotherapy rooms in Mount Massive's early era, large tiled spaces with industrial-sized tubs and equipment for water treatments that had been popular in psychiatric hospitals before pharmaceutical interventions became dominant. Some treatments had been benign, warm baths meant to soothe agitated patients. Others had been punitive, ice baths or high-pressure water used to subdue patients whose staff found difficult to control. The room still smelled of mildew and chlorine despite decades of disuse. Waylon's night vision. Goggles revealed details the darkness would have hidden. Rust stains that might have been blood, restraint points built into the walls and floors, observation windows where staff could watch treatments without being present in the rooms. These spaces had been designed for violence disguised as medicine. As he moved deeper into the old asylum sections, Waylon encountered more variants. These weren't the deliberately created products of the morphogenic engine, but older patients who'd apparently been confined in these forgotten areas for years or decades. Their conditions suggested long-term institutionalization, bodies showing signs of malnutrition and inadequate medical care, behaviors that indicated extended isolation, and psychological states that had deteriorated beyond anything that could be called functional. Some variants ignored him, too absorbed in their own internal worlds to register external threats. Others noticed but seemed more curious than hostile, approaching like they wanted interaction but didn't remember how to communicate. A few attacked, but their violence felt disorganized, panic responses rather than predatory behavior. Waylon defended himself when necessary, but avoided killing when possible. These patients were victims even more clearly than the morphogenic engine subjects. They'd been locked away and forgotten, left to deteriorate in sections of the asylum that Murkoff probably didn't even maintain, surviving on whatever food and water reached them through systems that kept them barely alive without providing anything resembling care. He found a patient who could still speak, an elderly man, emaciated, wearing patient clothing that might have been issued decades ago. The man grabbed Waylon's arm with surprising strength and spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "You can't leave. No one leaves. They won't let you. They need us here. Need us to stay so they can study us, measure how we break, learn what it takes to make human minds stop working. That's what this place is for. That's what it's always been for." Waylon tried to pull away gently, not wanting to hurt someone who was clearly more desperate than dangerous. The man's grip tightened. "I tried to leave. 1968. Found a door that wasn't locked. Made it outside, almost to the road. They brought me back, put me in isolation for 6 months. No light, no human contact. Just a cell and the sound of my own breathing. When they finally let me out, I couldn't remember my name anymore. Couldn't remember what I'd done to get committed. Couldn't remember anything except that I'd tried to leave and been punished for it." The man released Waylon's arm, his energy apparently exhausted by the brief conversation. He slumped against the wall, eyes losing focus. "Don't try to leave. They always bring you back. Better to accept it. Better to let the building have you. It's patient. It can wait forever." Waylon left the man there, disturbed by the encounter in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The asylum itself felt like an entity, not supernaturally, but institutionally. It was a machine designed to contain and process people, and that machine had been running for over a century, with only superficial changes to its fundamental purpose. Staff might change, specific procedures might evolve, but the core function remained. Take vulnerable people, subject them to procedures that benefit researchers rather than patients, and ensure they never leave in condition to testify about what happened. He found stairs leading up, away from the oldest sections, and toward what he hoped would be ground-level areas with potential exits. The stairs were metal, institutional construction, and they echoed with his footsteps in ways that made stealth impossible. He climbed past multiple landings, each opening onto different wings of the facility, until he reached a level that felt more recent, painted drywall instead of exposed brick, fluorescent lighting, fixtures instead of older incandescent systems. This was the administrative wing, the area where Mount Massive's day-to-day business had been conducted before the outbreak. Offices for doctors and administrators, file rooms containing patient records, meeting spaces where treatment plans were discussed and research protocols were approved. The area should have been abandoned during the chaos, but Waylon found evidence that some staff had attempted to secure themselves here during the initial outbreak. Barricaded doors, makeshift weapons, signs of defensive positions that had ultimately failed. He found bodies wearing staff uniforms. The variants had reached this area, and the confrontations had been brutal. Some staff had been killed quickly. Others showed signs of prolonged suffering, torture rather than simple murder, suggesting that patients who'd been subjected to abuse had found their abusers and taken time expressing their grievances. Waylon felt complicated emotions looking at these bodies. They were human beings who'd died horribly. They were also employees of an institution that had tortured patients for profit. Some might have been genuinely trying to provide care within a corrupt system. Others had probably been active participants in Murkoff's experiments. There was no way to know which was which now, and the variants who'd killed them clearly hadn't made distinctions. He entered an office that had belonged to someone senior, larger than the other workspaces, with a window offering views of the mountains surrounding the facility. The office had been ransacked, files pulled from cabinets and scattered across the floor. Waylon began reading, trying to understand more about Mount Massive's recent operations. He found financial documents showing Murkoff's investment in the facility. Hundreds of millions of dollars funneled through shell companies and research grants. He found correspondence with government agencies that reference classified programs and national security applications, and he found internal memos discussing the morphogenic engine's development, including the challenges researchers face trying to create stable results. The memos were clinical in tone but horrifying in content. Researchers discussed patient deaths as negative outcomes that provided useful data about procedure limitations. They noted that certain psychiatric profiles responded better to the engine's effects than others, leading to selection criteria that deliberately targeted patients with specific trauma histories. They acknowledged that the engine caused permanent psychological damage, but framed this as acceptable cost for achieving successful nanotechnology integration. One memo, authored by someone named Dr. Wernicke, discussed the Walrider project's ultimate goal, creating a controllable swarm intelligence that could serve as an assassination tool or psychological warfare weapon. The Walrider's host would need to be someone whose psychological structure could maintain coherent intention while merged with the nanomachine swarm. Most subjects failed at this stage, their minds fragmenting under the strain of hosting distributed consciousness. Billy Hope, according to Wernicke, was the first subject to achieve stable integration, making him invaluable to the project's success. Waylon understood now what Miles Upshur had destroyed by unplugging the morphogenic engine. Billy Hope wasn't just a patient being victimized by unethical experimentation. He was the control mechanism for a weapon that Murkoff had spent years and countless lives developing. Without Billy as host, the Walrider was uncontrolled, dangerous to everyone including Murkoff's personnel, but no longer useful as a deployable asset. Miles had sabotaged the entire project, and he'd died doing it, the Walrider killing him, or absorbing him, or doing something that Waylon still didn't fully understand. The thought made Waylon hold Miles's camera tighter. This device contained the only documentation of what had happened at Mount Massive. If he could escape with it, if he could get this footage to people who'd investigate and publish the truth, then Miles's death and the suffering of every patient trapped here might result in some form of justice. That was optimistic thinking, probably naive. Murkoff Corporation had resources and influence that extended into government agencies and legal systems. They'd buried scandals before, but Waylon clung to the possibility because the alternative was accepting that everyone who died here had died meaninglessly, their suffering producing nothing but profit for a corporation that would never face consequences. He pocketed additional documents that seemed particularly incriminating, stuffing them into his clothing where they might survive whatever came next. Then he continued searching for an exit. The administrative wing had multiple potential escape routes, windows that might be broken, doors leading to external sections of the facility, stairways that could reach ground level. But each route Waylon investigated was blocked. Windows were reinforced with security glass that his improvised tools couldn't break. External doors were locked with systems that required power or manual override codes he didn't have, and the stairways leading down ended in structural collapse or areas consumed by fire. He was trapped in a labyrinth that kept offering false hopes of escape, corridors that seemed to lead toward freedom but which ultimately circled back into the facility's interior. The asylum's architecture felt deliberately designed to prevent escape. Doors and hallways arranged to create confusion, sightlines blocked to prevent orientation. This was intentional, Waylon realized. Mount Massive had been designed in an era when psychiatric hospitals were expected to be escape-proof. Patients couldn't be trusted with freedom, so the buildings themselves were built as prisons disguised as medical facilities. Every architectural choice served dual purposes: therapeutic justification and containment function. He found himself in what looked like an auditorium or large meeting space. Rows of seating faced a stage area where presumably staff had conducted group therapy sessions or educational programming. The space was dark, his night vision barely penetrating the shadows that filled the large room. And he wasn't alone. Variants had gathered here, dozens of them sitting in the auditorium, seating like an audience waiting for a performance. They weren't attacking or showing obvious signs of aggression. They were simply present, watching the stage area where something was happening. Waylon moved carefully along the auditorium's perimeter, trying to understand what he was witnessing. On the stage stood a variant who was speaking to the assembled crowd, not the incoherent rambling of someone experiencing psychosis, but something closer to a sermon. The speaker was Father Martin, the patient whose religious delusions had made him into a prophet among Mount Massive's variant population. Martin had survived whatever chaos had consumed the facility's other areas. He stood on stage wearing improvised priest vestments, speaking about the Walrider with messianic conviction. He described it as an angel of destruction sent to purify the world, claimed that witnessing it was a blessing that few humans were worthy to receive, and promised that those who believed would be saved while non-believers would be consumed. The variants in the audience listened with expressions suggesting they believed him, or perhaps they were simply desperate for any explanation that made sense of what had happened, any framework that gave meaning to the outbreak and suffering. Martin provided that framework, transforming institutional horror into religious narrative where everything served divine purpose. Waylon tried to move past the auditorium without drawing attention, but Martin saw him. The priest's eyes locked onto Waylon with recognition that felt personal, like Martin had been waiting specifically for him to arrive. "Brother, come forward. You've been running from salvation, but God has guided you here so you can witness the truth. The gospel must be spread, and you will be my apostle, carrying word of what has happened here to the world beyond these walls." Waylon didn't move forward. He understood that accepting Martin's invitation meant becoming trapped in the priest's delusional framework, subjected to whatever Martin believed was necessary for apostolic preparation. But refusing openly would turn the assembled variants hostile, and there were too many to fight or escape. Martin descended from the stage, moving toward Waylon with arms spread in welcome. His voice carried the warm certainty of someone who'd found absolute truth and couldn't imagine anyone rejecting it. "You're afraid, I understand. The presence of divinity is terrifying to those who haven't been properly prepared, but I can help you. I can show you how to open your mind and heart to receive what the Walrider has to offer. It requires sacrifice, The old self must die so the new self can be born, but I promise that what awaits on the other side of that death is more glorious than anything you've experienced in this limited, mortal existence." Martin reached Waylon, placing a hand on his shoulder with surprising gentleness. His eyes showed genuine care, the expression of someone who believed he was offering help rather than harm. "Come with me. Let me prepare you. And when you're ready, when your mind has been opened sufficiently, I'll show you the Walrider's true form. Not the limited glimpse that terrifies the faithless, but the full revelation that transforms witnesses into believers." Waylon was saved from having to respond by another explosion, smaller than the previous one, but close enough that the auditorium's walls shook and ceiling tiles fell onto the seating area. The variants scattered, panicked by the structural instability. Martin's attention shifted to calming his congregation, and Waylon used the chaos to slip away, exiting the auditorium through a side door that opened onto another corridor. He was breathing hard, adrenaline making his hands shake. Every encounter drained resources he didn't have: mental energy, physical endurance, the psychological fortitude required to witness horror without letting it break his ability to function. He'd been navigating Mount Massive's nightmare for hours, possibly longer. Time had become impossible to track without natural light or functioning clocks. He needed to rest, to find somewhere he could stop moving and let his body recover enough to continue. But stopping meant vulnerability, meant being a stationary target in a facility full of things that hunted. The calculus was impossible. Keep moving and collapse from exhaustion, or stop and risk being found. He compromised by finding a small room, a supply closet, or equipment storage space, and securing himself inside. The door could be locked from the interior, providing minimal protection. The space was cramped, barely large enough to sit, but it was empty of threats and hidden enough that casual patrols wouldn't notice it. Waylon sat with his back against the wall, holding Miles's camera against his chest, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd experienced. He thought about his wife and sons, whether they'd already been told he was dead, whether they'd accepted Murkoff's explanation or suspected something more complicated. He thought about the patients he'd seen, brutalized and killed, people whose mental illness had made them vulnerable to institutional predation. He thought about Eddie Gluskin's operating table and Father Martin's sermon, and the elderly patient who told him no one ever really leaves Mount Massive. He thought about giving up, about simply staying in this closet until someone found him, or until he died from dehydration, or until the facility's fires reached this area and solved his problems through immolation. It would be easier than continuing, easier than facing whatever waited in the sections of the asylum he hadn't explored yet. But he couldn't give up, because Lisa and his sons deserved to know what had happened to him, because the patients who died deserved someone to carry evidence of their suffering into the world, because Miles Upshur had given him this camera with the explicit purpose of ensuring the documentation survived, even if the people who'd witnessed the events didn't. Waylon allowed himself 10 minutes of rest. Then he stood, unlocked the closet door, and continued toward whatever sections of Mount Massive remained between him and freedom. Chapter 5. The Cannibal and the Underground. The smell reached Waylon before he saw its source, a combination of rotten cooking meat that made his stomach twist. He'd entered a kitchen area, one of the facility's food preparation spaces where institutional meals would have been made for hundreds of patients. Industrial-sized ovens dominated one wall, preparation counters stretched across the room, refrigeration units stood open, their contents long since spoiled during the power failures. Someone had been using the kitchen. Someone was still using it. The ovens were warm, heat radiating from them despite the facility's general state of abandonment. Pots sat on stove burners with contents that bubbled and steamed, and on the preparation counters there were portions of meat in various stages of processing. Waylon understood what he was looking at, even though his mind tried to reject the conclusion. This wasn't animal meat from the facility's food stores. The cuts were wrong, the bone structure too distinctly human. Someone had been butchering bodies and preparing them as food. He heard movement in the kitchen storage area, heavy footsteps, the sound of dragging weight. He looked for hiding places, but the kitchen was too open, designed for efficiency rather than concealment. He pressed himself against a wall near the entrance, hoping whoever was coming would pass without noticing him. The man who emerged from storage was massive, easily over 250 pounds, built with the kind of bulk that suggested power rather than obesity. He wore patient clothing that had been modified into an apron of sorts, covered in stains that were definitely blood. His face was distorted by some combination of scarring and apparent self-mutilation, features that might have been human but which had been altered into something that belonged in nightmare taxonomy. Chris Walker. Waylon recognized him from files he'd encountered. A former military police officer who'd been admitted to Mount Massive with severe PTSD and had been subjected to morphogenic engine procedures that had pushed his existing psychosis into territory that defied standard psychiatric categorization. Walker moved with purpose that suggested he was on a mission, functioning according to some internal logic that no longer aligned with observable reality. Walker was dragging a body another patient recently killed. He hefted it onto one of the preparation counters with casual strength, then reached for a knife from the array of kitchen tools hanging on the wall. He began processing the body with efficiency that suggested he'd done this many times before. Waylon remained frozen against the wall, trying to control his breathing and not make any sound that would draw Walker's attention. But Walker paused in his work, head tilting like an animal sensing nearby prey. His voice when he spoke was a low growl that barely qualified as language. "Smelled you when you entered. Tried to sneak past. Didn't work. Never works. I always find them." Walker turned, his eyes fixing on Waylon's position with predatory focus. There was no point in hiding anymore. Waylon moved away from the wall, positioning himself so he could run if an opportunity appeared. Walker watched him with expression that mixed calculation with something that might have been amusement. "You're not like the others. Not a variant. Still have your mind. That makes you dangerous. Dangerous things need to be contained." Walker moved toward him with speed that shouldn't have been possible for someone his size. Waylon ran, exiting the kitchen and entering a corridor that branched in multiple directions. He heard Walker pursuing, not running but walking with heavy, measured steps that felt somehow more threatening than sprint speed chase. The pursuit became a nightmare of navigation through Mount Massive's lower levels. Waylon ran through storage areas, past boiler rooms, through maintenance tunnels that were barely tall enough to stand in. Walker followed consistently, never quite close enough to grab him, but never far enough behind that Waylon could stop and catch his breath. Walker's voice echoed through the corridors, speaking to himself or to Waylon or to people who weren't present. "Have to maintain containment, have to stop the breach. Command says eliminate all hostiles. This is my mission. This is what I'm trained for." Waylon understood that Walker wasn't fully present in this moment. His PTSD and the morphogenic engine's effects had trapped him in some version of military service, where Mount Massive was a combat zone, and everyone he encountered was either friendly forces or enemy combatants. Waylon had been designated hostile, which meant Walker wouldn't stop until he'd neutralized the threat. He found stairs leading further down into sections of the facility he hadn't known existed. The architecture changed as he descended, more industrial, less concerned with appearing like a medical facility. This was Mount Massive's infrastructure level, where pipes and electrical conduits and mechanical systems maintained the asylum's basic functions. And this was where Waylon made a mistake. The corridor he entered terminated in a dead end, a wall with no doors, no vents large enough to escape through, nothing except pipes running vertically and disappearing into the ceiling. He'd trapped himself. Walker appeared at the corridor's entrance, blocking the only exit. His expression showed satisfaction at the successful hunt. He approached slowly, savoring the moment before capture. Shouldn't have run. Makes it worse. Always makes it worse. Now you're not just hostile. You're a runner. Runners get special treatment. Waylon searched desperately for any option. The pipes were too smooth to climb. The walls were concrete without handholds. There was nowhere to go and nothing to use as weapon against someone Walker's size. He was caught. Walker reached for him, hands large enough to wrap completely around Waylon's torso. And then something hit Walker from the side with enough force to stagger him. Another variant, one of the smaller ones Waylon had seen throughout the facility. The variant attacked Walker with improvised weapon, striking him repeatedly while Walker tried to grab his new attacker. Waylon didn't wait to see how the confrontation resolved. He ran past the fighting variants, back through the corridor, back up the stairs he'd descended. Behind him he heard sounds of violence, impact and breaking bone, and eventually silence that suggested one of them had won and the other had died. He emerged into a section of the facility he hadn't seen before. Modern construction, probably added during Murkoff's renovation of Mount Massive. The corridors were wider, the lighting was better, where emergency systems still functioned, and the overall design suggested this area had been intended for staff rather than patients. He found an office complex, cubicles and workstations where administrative personnel had presumably managed the asylum's day-to-day operations. Computer monitors sat dark on desks. Paperwork remained scattered, where staff had abandoned their work during the outbreak. Coffee mugs still sat beside keyboards, their contents long since cold. It felt like walking through a moment frozen in time, the instant when normal institutional operations had collapsed into chaos, when employees had realized something was catastrophically wrong and had fled without even pausing to save their work or secure sensitive documents. Waylon sat at one of the workstations, using the moment of relative safety to examine Miles's camera more closely. The device still had battery power, somehow surviving everything Waylon had endured. He cycled through the recorded footage, seeing what Miles had documented during his own navigation through Mount Massive. The footage was extensive. Miles had filmed everything: his arrival at the asylum, his encounters with variants, his discovery of the morphogenic engine, his confrontation with Jeremy Blair. Watching it, Waylon understood the full scope of what had happened. Miles had documented proof not just of Murkoff's experiments, but of the entire institutional structure that made those experiments possible. The footage included recordings of documents Miles had found, financial records showing money trails that connected Murkoff to government agencies and international corporations. It showed video files from security cameras that Murkoff had preserved, recordings of procedures being performed on patients, deaths occurring during experiments, staff discussing how to dispose of bodies and falsify medical records. This was more than evidence of crimes. This was a complete map of institutional corruption, showing exactly how a corporation could torture and kill with impunity by hiding behind psychiatric treatment justifications and buying cooperation from regulatory agencies that should have provided oversight. If this footage survived, if it reached journalists, and investigators who weren't on Murkoff's payroll, the consequences would be catastrophic for everyone involved in Mount Massive's operations. Corporate executives would face criminal charges. Government officials would be implicated in cover-ups. The entire framework that allowed facilities like this to exist would face public scrutiny. That's why Murkoff couldn't let this footage leave the facility. That's why Waylon's escape wasn't just about personal survival, but about ensuring that the evidence he carried had the opportunity to destroy the system that had created this nightmare. He needed to find an exit, soon, before exhaustion or injury or simple bad luck killed him and left Miles's camera buried in Mount Massive's ruins where it would never be found. Waylon continued through the office complex, searching for any door or window or access point that might lead outside. He found a corridor marked external access, with arrows pointing toward what seemed promising. He followed the signs through multiple turns until he reached a security checkpoint, a reinforced door with keycard reader and biometric scanner. The checkpoint was designed to prevent unauthorized exit, ensuring that patients and staff without proper credentials couldn't leave without permission. During normal operations, it would have been staffed by security personnel. Now it was abandoned, the security systems either locked down or disabled by power failures. Waylon examined the door's locking mechanism. It was electronic, requiring power to operate, but there was a manual override system, a mechanical backup designed to allow exit during emergencies. The override required a physical key, which Waylon didn't have, but the mechanism itself was exposed enough that someone with tools and mechanical knowledge might be able to force it. He searched nearby offices for anything that could serve as improvised tools. He found a screwdriver in a maintenance kit, a letter opener that could function as thin pry bar, and a heavy stapler that could provide hammering weight. Using these improvised tools, he began working on the manual override mechanism. The work was slow and frustrating. The mechanism was designed to resist exactly this kind of tampering, but Waylon had spent years working with mechanical and electronic systems, understanding how they functioned and where their weak points were. He applied patient pressure to components that seemed load-bearing, listened for sounds that indicated movement in the locking system, and gradually convinced the mechanism that it was receiving legitimate override commands. 30 minutes of sustained effort produced a click that sounded like mechanical surrender. The lock disengaged. Waylon pulled the heavy door open and felt cold air rush in from outside. He'd reached the exterior of Mount Massive Asylum. The facility's courtyard lay before him, open space surrounded by the asylum's various wings. Beyond the courtyard, he could see the facility's perimeter fence, and beyond that, the mountain terrain that isolated Mount Massive from nearby towns and highways. Freedom was visible, close enough to smell the pine trees and feel the night air against his skin, close enough that Waylon allowed himself to believe he might actually survive this. He stepped out of the facility, moving quickly across the courtyard toward the perimeter fence. The night was clear, stars visible overhead in patterns he'd almost forgotten existed. His night vision goggles flickered and died, battery finally exhausted, but natural moonlight provided enough illumination to navigate. He was halfway across the courtyard when he saw it. Miles Upsher's Jeep, parked where the journalist had left it before entering Mount Massive. The vehicle sat near the facility's main gate, keys presumably still inside if Waylon could reach it. Freedom was that close, an operational vehicle that could take him away from this nightmare. He ran toward the Jeep, every step feeling like it might be his last. His body was failing, blood loss from cuts and abrasions, exhaustion from hours of running, the pharmaceutical residue still fogging his thoughts. But the Jeep was there, real and close, and if he could just reach it. Waylon grabbed the driver's door handle. It was unlocked. The keys were in the ignition, exactly where Miles had left them. He climbed into the driver's seat, hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. Before he could start the engine, someone grabbed him from behind. Jeremy Blair appeared in the Jeep's doorway, having pursued Waylon from inside the facility. The executive's face was twisted with rage that went beyond professional concern about corporate liability. This was personal. Fury at a subordinate who dared to challenge institutional authority, at someone who'd exposed crimes that should have remained hidden. "You don't get to leave," Blair hissed. "You don't get to destroy everything we've built and walk away. None of this reaches the outside world. None of it." Blair had a knife. He drove it into Waylon's side, the blade sliding between ribs with practiced precision. Waylon gasped, feeling the weapon's cold metal against organs that shouldn't be exposed to air. Blair twisted the knife, then withdrew it for another strike. Waylon tried to fight back, but his body wouldn't respond properly. Blood filled his mouth. His vision narrowed to a tunnel with Blair's face at its center. This was how it ended. Not killed by variance or fire, but murdered by a corporate executive protecting institutional secrets. Blair raised the knife for a killing blow. His expression showed satisfaction, certainty that he'd contained the threat. Then something seized him. The Walrider manifested behind Blair, visible as distortion in the air, as shadow with impossible movement, as swarm intelligence that had followed Waylon from the facility's interior. It grabbed Blair with forces that human bodies weren't designed to resist. The executive screamed as he was lifted off the ground and pulled away from the Jeep. Waylon heard sounds he couldn't identify, tearing and breaking, and something that might have been Blair begging. Then silence broken only by the wind and the distant sound of Mount Massive burning. He looked toward where Blair had been pulled. The Walrider stood there, or the thing that had been Miles Upshur stood there. Consciousness merged with a nanotech swarm in ways that created something no longer entirely human. It regarded Waylon with focus that suggested recognition, perhaps even concern. Miles, or what Miles had become. The journalist had given his life to destroy the morphogenic engine, and now existed as the very weapon Murkoff had tried to create. And in that form, he'd saved Waylon one final time. Waylon met what might have been Miles's eyes. He tried to speak, to say thank you, or I'm sorry, or something that acknowledged the sacrifice and the horror of what Miles had become. No words came, just blood and pain and the overwhelming need to escape before his injuries made driving impossible. He turned the Jeep's ignition. The engine roared to life. He put the vehicle in gear and drove toward the facility's exit, watching the Walrider in his rearview mirror, watching it stand there like a sentinel, making sure he actually left. The gate was open. Waylon drove through, onto the access road that wound down the mountain. Every bump sent pain lancing through his side where Blair's knife had struck. He pressed his hand against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding, knowing he might bleed out before reaching help, but unable to stop driving. In the mirror, Mount Massive Asylum receded, fires consuming its upper levels, smoke rising into the dawn sky, and somewhere in that burning structure, the Walrider continued existing. Miles Upshur, journalist and accidental weapon, remained at the facility he'd come to investigate. Whether he was trapped there or chose to stay, Waylon would never know. He was outside Mount Massive's perimeter, free in the technical sense that no physical barriers now constrained him. He began running through the mountain terrain, moving away from the facility as quickly as the uneven ground and darkness allowed. Trees offered concealment. Distance offered hope. He ran until his body refused to continue, until he collapsed in a clearing and lay on ground covered in pine needles, breathing hard and feeling like he might die from the simple exertion. But he was alive, He'd escaped. He carried evidence that could destroy Murkoff Corporation. The nightmare was over, except it wasn't. Not really, because nightmares don't end simply because you wake up. Sometimes they follow you home. Chapter 6. The Man Who Came Home. The police found Waylon Park's Jeep crashed on the mountain road 4 miles from Mount Massive Asylum. Driver's side door open, blood on the steering wheel and seats. They found Waylon himself collapsed on the roadside, hypothermic and barely conscious from blood loss, still clutching a camera that he wouldn't let anyone take from him. He'd driven until his body gave out, then crawled from the vehicle, somehow convinced he needed to keep moving away from the facility even though his wounds made further travel impossible. The officers who discovered him were responding to reports of fire at the facility, a blaze visible for miles, columns of smoke rising into the dawn sky like funeral pyres. They'd expected to find injured staff or escaping patients. Instead, they found a man in patient clothing who kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "I have evidence. Don't let them take it. I have evidence." The officers called for medical transport. Waylon was taken to a hospital in the nearest town, treated for exposure and minor injuries, and placed under observation while authorities tried to determine his identity. He had no identification on him. The night vision goggles mounted to his skull suggested he'd been a patient at Mount Massive, but hospital staff couldn't understand why psychiatric patients would have such equipment, or how he'd survived exposure to conditions that should have caused more severe medical consequences. Waylon refused to answer questions about his identity until he received legal representation. The officers treating him were sympathetic, but confused. This didn't match the profile of an escaped psychiatric patient. His behavior was too organized, his concerns too specific and reality-based. He seemed like someone who'd survived trauma rather than someone experiencing mental illness. Eventually, through fingerprint records from his previous security clearances, authorities identified him as Waylon Park, software engineer, reported deceased in a traffic accident 2 weeks earlier. This revelation created bureaucratic confusion that took hours to resolve. Death certificates had been filed. Insurance claims had been processed. His employer had memorial records showing he died in the line of duty, but Waylon Park was manifestly alive, sitting in a hospital bed, insisting that his death had been faked by Murkoff Corporation as cover for his forced commitment to Mount Massive Asylum. A detective arrived to take his statement. Waylon explained everything: the email he'd sent to Miles Upshur, his capture and forcible commitment, the experiments he'd witnessed, the outbreak that had allowed his escape. He gave the detective Miles's camera and explained that the footage would corroborate his account. The detective watched portions of the footage. What he saw was hours of documentation showing the interior of Mount Massive during the outbreak, variants attacking people, evidence of human experimentation, recordings that clearly showed illegal activities occurring at a facility that was supposed to be conducting legitimate psychiatric research. The detective made calls. More investigators arrived. Federal agents appeared, representing agencies whose involvement suggested that Mount Massive's operations had implications beyond local criminal jurisdiction. Waylon repeated his story multiple times to different audiences, each repetition feeling more surreal as he watched officials react with combinations of horror and careful, bureaucratic distance. The investigation that followed was extensive and largely concealed from public view. Federal authorities secured Mount Massive's remains, cataloging evidence from sections of the facility that hadn't been destroyed by fire. They recovered bodies, patients, and staff who died during the outbreak, and began the process of identifying victims and determining causes of death. They seized Murkoff's financial records and communications, building a case that would eventually implicate dozens of corporate executives and government officials in conspiracy to commit torture, murder, and violations of medical ethics. But the investigation moved slowly. Murkoff Corporation deployed legal resources to challenge every subpoena and contest every evidence disclosure. Government agencies whose personnel had provided oversight or funding for Mount Massive's research had institutional interest in limiting revelations that would implicate them in the atrocities. The same dynamics that had allowed the facility to operate with impunity for years now worked to prevent full accountability. Waylon was placed in protective custody while the investigation proceeded. The authorities treating him believed his account, but acknowledged that Murkoff represented significant threat to anyone who could testify about Mount Massive's operations. Witnesses had disappeared before. Evidence had been destroyed. Legal proceedings had been sabotaged through methods that suggested corporate resources vastly exceeding normal criminal enterprises. During this period, Waylon struggled with psychological aftermath that didn't fit standard trauma categories. He hadn't just witnessed horror. He'd been subjected to chemical manipulation, had been forcibly committed and told his family believed him dead, had navigated environments designed to destroy human psychology. The combination created symptoms that therapists found difficult to treat because the trauma was so extensive and multifaceted. He experienced nightmares where he was still trapped in Mount Massive, where every exit he found led back into the facility's interior, where the asylum itself had become infinite labyrinth from which escape was conceptually impossible. He experienced hypervigilance that made normal social interactions feel threatening. He experienced difficulty trusting authority figures, reasonable given that institutional authority had been weaponized against him, and he experienced guilt about the people he'd been unable to save, patients who'd died while he fled, staff who'd been killed by variants, and Miles Upshur who'd sacrificed himself to destroy the morphogenic engine. Therapy helped, but recovery was slow and incomplete. Trauma of this magnitude doesn't fully resolve. It becomes something you carry, weight that shifts and sometimes lightens but never entirely disappears. 6 months after his escape, Waylon was finally allowed to return home. The legal proceedings were still ongoing, but immediate danger had passed. Murkoff's public exposure had destroyed the corporation's ability to conduct covert operations. The executives most directly responsible for Mount Massive were facing criminal charges, and Waylon's testimony had been documented extensively enough that killing him would serve no strategic purpose. His wife Lisa opened the door when he arrived, her expression cycling through disbelief and relief and anger in rapid succession. She'd been told he was dead. She'd mourned him. She'd begun the process of rebuilding her life as a widow, and then federal agents had appeared, explaining that her husband was actually alive, had been held captive at a psychiatric facility, and would be returning home once protective. Custody was no longer necessary. The reunion was complicated. Lisa wanted answers that Waylon couldn't fully provide, explanations for why he'd sent that email, why he'd risked his family's security by confronting a corporation powerful enough to fake his death, why he'd chosen moral principles over practical safety. Waylon didn't have satisfying answers. He'd done what his conscience required, and the consequences had been catastrophic for everyone involved. His sons didn't understand what had happened. They were too young to process the details, knew only that their father had been gone and now had returned, somehow different in ways they couldn't articulate. Waylon tried to resume normal family life, but normalcy felt like performance. He went through motions of domesticity, while feeling like he was still navigating Mount Massive's corridors, still listening for variant footsteps, still calculating escape routes from every room he entered. The footage from Miles's camera was eventually released to the public through journalists who'd been investigating Murkoff independently. The release was heavily redacted. Authorities removed content that depicted graphic violence or that might identify specific victims without family consent, but enough remained to show the world what had happened at Mount Massive Asylum. The public response was intense but short-lived. There was outrage, congressional hearings, calls for reform of oversight systems that governed psychiatric research. But within months, other scandals displaced Mount Massive from news cycles. Murkoff Corporation declared bankruptcy and dissolved into successor entities that claimed no responsibility for predecessor crimes. Government officials who'd provided funding or oversight retired or were quietly reassigned. The patients who died at Mount Massive became statistics in reports that fewer people read each month. Waylon watched this happen with emotions he couldn't fully name. He'd survived, specifically to ensure that evidence reached the world. Miles had died to give him that opportunity, and the world had received the evidence, been briefly horrified, and then moved on to other concerns as though institutional torture was just another scandal rather than proof that systems designed to protect vulnerable people were actually mechanisms for exploiting them. The legal proceedings resulted in convictions for several Murkoff executives, sentences that were substantial enough to appear serious but which would likely be reduced through appeals. Jeremy Blair, the executive vice president who had orchestrated Waylon's illegal imprisonment, was killed by the Walrider during the final escape attempt, his death caught on camera by witnesses who survived the encounter. Dr. Wernicke, the scientist who designed the engine itself, was never found, presumably having fled to jurisdiction without extradition treaties with the United States. The surviving patients from Mount Massive were more complicated. Many had died during the outbreak or the fire that followed. Others were recovered in various states of psychological damage, requiring long-term psychiatric care in facilities that hopefully wouldn't replicate the abuses they'd already suffered. A few, including some of the variants, were never found, either dead in sections of Mount Massive that hadn't been fully excavated, or having escaped into the surrounding wilderness, where they continued existing in whatever forms the morphogenic engine had created. Billy Hope's body was recovered and buried with ceremony that acknowledged him as a victim rather than a threat. The Walrider was never found. Authorities conducted extensive searches of Mount Massive's ruins and surrounding areas, but discovered no evidence of the nanotech swarm's continued existence. The official conclusion was that the Walrider had dispersed or deactivated when Billy died, its coherence requiring a host that no longer existed. Waylon didn't believe that explanation. He remembered the Walrider attacking the helicopter in Mount Massive's courtyard, remembered it freeing him from restraints and allowing him to escape. It had been fully active after Billy's death, coherent enough to distinguish between threats and non-threats. Something that sophisticated didn't simply disperse. It adapted. It survived. And it was still out there somewhere, purpose and intentions unknown. But this was speculation he kept to himself. He'd provided his testimony and evidence. The rest was beyond his control. Chapter 7. The Variants Who Survived. Not every story from Mount Massive ended with Waylon's escape. Some continued in directions he wouldn't learn about until later, through investigation reports and legal documents, and occasional news stories about incidents that authorities tried to suppress, but which leaked anyway. Eddie Gluskin's fate remains officially unknown. He was last seen in the vocational block during Waylon's escape, injured but alive when the fires began spreading through the facility. His body was never recovered from Mount Massive's ruins. Some investigative reports suggest someone matching his description may have been spotted in wilderness areas in the weeks following the outbreak, but these sightings were never confirmed. Whether he died in the facility, escaped, and succumbed to injuries, or somehow survived to continue his pathology elsewhere, remains one of Mount Massive's unresolved mysteries, a detail that haunts both investigators and survivors who understand what he was capable of. Father Martin's fate was unclear. His body was never recovered from Mount Massive's ruins, leading to speculation that he'd escaped or had been consumed entirely by the facility's fires. Witnesses reported seeing someone matching his description in various locations over the following months, always preaching about an angel of destruction, always gathering followers who seemed to believe his messianic claims. But these sightings were never confirmed, and Martin was eventually declared legally dead. Chris Walker's remains were found in the underground facility where he'd been pursuing Miles Upshur, killed by the Walrider after years of being used as Murkoff's unwilling enforcer. His death was tragic confirmation that his PTSD and the morphogenic engine's effects had destroyed any possibility of him receiving the treatment he'd needed. He'd been a soldier who'd served his country and had been betrayed by every system that should have helped him afterward. Military health care that failed to properly treat his combat trauma, a psychiatric facility that experimented on him rather than healing him, and a corporation that had viewed his psychological damage as resource to be exploited. Richard Traeger died in an elevator in the administrative wing. Miles Upshur pushed him out as the elevator descended, crushing Traeger between the elevator car and the shaft. Waylon would later see Traeger's mangled corpse during his own navigation through that section. Traeger's corporate background revealed a history of rising through Murkoff's ranks specifically because his antisocial personality traits made him effective at making decisions that prioritized profit over ethics. He'd been involved in multiple questionable projects before Mount Massive, always managing to avoid personal consequences while the people harmed by his decisions suffered. The twins were never found. Authorities couldn't even confirm their identities. Records suggested they'd been patients admitted under designations rather than names, and Murkoff's documentation was deliberately obscure about their histories before Mount Massive. They existed in reports as evidence that the morphogenic engine could create what the documents called psychological fusion states, where individual identities merged into shared consciousness. Whether they died in the facility or escaped was unknown. These weren't the only variants, just the most notable ones. Mount Massive had processed hundreds of patients through the morphogenic engine over the years before the outbreak. Most had died during the procedures or shortly after from complications. Some had been maintained in the facility as ongoing test subjects. A few had been released after being declared sufficiently stable, though what stable meant in Murkoff's assessment was questionable. Tracking down surviving variants became a quiet priority for federal investigators, not publicized but pursued through channels that suggested concern about ongoing threat. Variants who were located were placed in secure psychiatric facilities, hopefully receiving actual treatment this time rather than further experimentation. But the fact that this process was conducted quietly suggested authorities were concerned about public reaction to the revelation that Mount Massive's products were now distributed throughout society. Waylon occasionally wondered how many people he'd encountered in daily life might be former Murkoff subjects, people whose psychiatric conditions had been deliberately worsened, who were now trying to function in a world that had no idea what had been done to them. The thought was disturbing not because these people were necessarily dangerous, but because it suggested that institutional abuse's effects extended far beyond immediate victims, rippling outward into communities and relationships in ways that were impossible to track or address. Chapter 8. What if the whistleblower carried years past? The intensity of Waylon's immediate trauma gradually diminished, though it never fully disappeared. He found employment again, avoiding positions that would require security clearances or extensive background checks. His family adapted to having him present, though the version of Waylon who came home from Mount Massive wasn't identical to the person who'd accepted that software contract. He'd changed in ways that were difficult to articulate. He was more suspicious of authority, more attuned to power dynamics in institutions, more likely to question official explanations for events. These weren't necessarily negative changes. Healthy skepticism about institutional authority was arguably more realistic than naive trust, but they made him feel disconnected from people who still believed that systems generally worked as intended, that oversight mechanisms prevented widespread abuse, that what happened at Mount Massive was aberration rather than example of patterns that existed everywhere institutional power exceeded accountability. He stayed in contact with some of the other survivors, staff members who'd escaped Mount Massive and were willing to testify despite personal risk. They formed an informal support network, people who understood what they'd experienced in ways that therapists and family members couldn't fully grasp. These relationships were complicated by shared trauma, but valuable because they provided context that made individual experiences feel less isolating. One question haunted Waylon throughout his recovery. Had sending that email been worth the consequences? He'd exposed Murkoff's crimes. He'd ensured that evidence reached people who could investigate and prosecute. He'd contributed to legal proceedings that resulted in some form of justice for Mount Massive's victims. These were real accomplishments. But he'd also traumatized his family, had been unable to save most of Mount Massive's patients, and had witnessed the public's attention cycle move on from the revelations within months. The systemic issues that allowed Mount Massive to exist, inadequate oversight of psychiatric research, corporations with resources to corrupt regulatory agencies, societal willingness to accept that psychiatric patients were acceptable research subjects, hadn't been meaningfully addressed. Murkoff had dissolved, but its successors continued operating. Government agencies had been embarrassed, but institutional structures remained unchanged. Was partial justice worth complete trauma? Was exposing one atrocity sufficient when the systems that enabled it continued functioning? These questions didn't have satisfying answers. Lisa eventually told him that she didn't need him to justify his choices, that she understood his actions even when she wished he'd made different ones, and that their family would recover regardless. This acceptance helped, though it didn't fully resolve Waylon's complicated feelings about what he'd sacrificed and what he'd accomplished. His sons grew older, eventually reaching ages where they could understand more complete explanations of what had happened to their father. Waylon told them edited versions of the story, emphasizing that he'd witnessed people being hurt and had tried to help them, and that sometimes trying to help carries costs that aren't obvious until you're already committed. He didn't want them to learn that moral action required accepting catastrophic personal consequences, but he also didn't want them to believe that doing the right thing was always safe or rewarded. The nightmares became less frequent but never entirely stopped. Waylon would dream of being back at Mount Massive, navigating corridors that shifted and changed, pursued by variants whose faces blended features from everyone he'd encountered. He'd dream of Eddie Gluskin's operating table, of Father Martin's sermons, of Chris Walker's relentless pursuit. He'd dream of the Walrider, that shadow swarm that had killed so many, but had also freed him, whose continued existence felt like unresolved threat waiting to manifest. Therapy helped him develop tools for managing these dreams, grounding techniques that reminded him he was safe, cognitive strategies that distinguished memory from present reality, and acceptance that trauma this severe leaves permanent traces. He learned to function with the nightmares rather than expecting them to disappear entirely. He maintained Miles Upsher's camera, the device that had captured evidence ensuring that Murkoff's crimes couldn't be completely buried. It sat in a secure location, no longer needed for legal proceedings but preserved as artifact of what had happened. Sometimes Waylon would take it out and hold it, remembering Miles's dedication to investigating and documenting truth regardless of personal danger, remembering that Miles had died specifically to ensure this evidence survived. The camera felt like a memorial and a reminder, proof that individuals could resist institutional evil, even when resistance seemed futile, but also proof that resistance often cost everything. Chapter 9. The Truth About Institutional Horror. Understanding Outlast. Whistleblower requires understanding what it reveals about how institutions enable atrocity. Mount Massive Asylum wasn't operated by obviously evil people cackling about their wickedness. It was staffed by professionals who'd convinced themselves that their work served legitimate purposes, advancing scientific knowledge, serving national security interests, treating patients who couldn't be helped through conventional methods. Jeremy Blair genuinely believed Murkoff's research was important. Dr. Wernicke saw the morphogenic engine as breakthrough that would revolutionize human consciousness studies. The staff who administered procedures convinced themselves they were following protocols approved by people smarter and better informed than themselves. Even the guards and orderlies who directly interacted with patients managed to rationalize their participation through combinations of obedience to authority, financial necessity, and psychological distance from victims' suffering. This is how institutional horror operates. It distributes responsibility across so many people that no single individual feels fully accountable. It frames cruelty as necessary procedure. It selects personnel who are either psychologically disposed to accept authority without question, or who are desperate enough for employment that they'll suppress moral objections. And it creates hierarchies where people at each level can claim they were just following orders, while people at higher levels claim they didn't know specific details of implementation. Mount Massive could exist because psychiatric patients occupy vulnerable social position. They're people whose perceptions are routinely questioned, whose complaints are dismissed as symptoms rather than credible reports, who can be involuntarily committed and subjected to treatments they don't consent to. Society has decided that mental illness justifies removing certain rights and autonomy, creating populations that institutions can exploit with minimal risk of accountability. The morphogenic engine represents an extreme version of real psychiatric procedures that have been used throughout history: electroshock therapy, insulin coma therapy, surgical interventions, pharmaceutical experiments. These procedures have always been presented as treatment, as efforts to help patients who couldn't be helped through less invasive methods, and some genuinely were therapeutic when properly applied. But the same techniques could be weaponized, turned into torture that destroyed rather than healed, especially when applied to captive populations by researchers who viewed outcome data as more important than individual patient welfare. Outlast Whistleblower shows this weaponization process. Every variant Waylon encountered Eddie Gluskin, Father Martin, Chris Walker, was a person who'd entered Mount Massive with treatable psychiatric conditions. They became monsters because Murkoff deliberately made them worse, amplified their pathologies, and then studied the results. This wasn't medical malpractice. This was systematic transformation of human suffering into profitable research data. The game's horror is effective because it's grounded in reality. MK Ultra actually happened. Psychiatric hospitals actually conducted experiments on patients without informed consent. Corporations actually have funded research that violated ethical boundaries. The specific details are fictional, but the fundamental dynamics are documented historical fact. Waylon Park represents the individual who stumbles onto institutional evil and has to decide whether to look away or resist. His choice to resist is presented as morally correct but catastrophically costly. He loses everything. His family believes he's dead. He's subjected to trauma that will affect him permanently. The game doesn't reward his moral action with conventional happy ending. It rewards him with survival and the knowledge that he did what his conscience required, even though the world largely moved on from the revelations he helped expose. This feels authentic to whistleblower experiences. People who expose institutional wrongdoing typically face retaliation, ostracism, and psychological damage that persists long after immediate danger has passed. They're rarely celebrated. They're often portrayed as troublemakers or mentally unstable individuals whose claims shouldn't be taken seriously. And even when they're eventually vindicated, the vindication comes too late and too partially to undo the damage they've suffered. Miles Upshur represents journalism's role in exposing institutional evil. He investigates because he believes truth matters, because he thinks documenting atrocities might create accountability. His death demonstrates the risk of that work and the dedication required to pursue it despite danger. The fact that his footage eventually reaches the public is presented as meaningful accomplishment, but not one that erases his death or fully prevents similar atrocities in the future. The variants represent what happens to people who fall into institutional machinery designed to exploit rather than help them. They're not monsters because of their mental illness, but because someone deliberately weaponized their vulnerabilities. Viewing them only as threats misses the tragedy of what was done to them. They're simultaneously dangerous and victims, perpetrators who are also casualties of systems that destroyed them. Understanding this complexity is essential to understanding Outlast Whistleblower's horror. The game isn't just about scary, mentally ill people chasing you through an asylum. It's about how institutions create those threats by systematically breaking vulnerable people, how individuals who resist institutional evil face consequences that make resistance feel irrational, and how societies prefer to forget atrocities rather than address the systemic issues that enabled them. Chapter 10: The Walrider's Choice. There's one element of Outlast Whistleblower that doesn't fully resolve within the game's narrative, but which has implications that extend beyond Waylon's escape: the question of what the Walrider wanted and why. It allowed Waylon to leave Mount Massive alive. The Walrider was presented as a weapon, as nanotech swarm controlled through Billy Hope's consciousness. But the events of the outbreak suggest something more complex. When Billy died, the Walrider didn't simply deactivate. It continued operating with apparent intentionality, killing some people and sparing others according to logic that wasn't immediately obvious. It killed Jeremy Blair and Murkoff's security forces. It destroyed the helicopter attempting to recapture Waylon, but it freed Waylon from restraints and allowed him to escape. This suggests the Walrider had capacity for distinguishing between targets, for making choices about who deserved violence and who deserved mercy. One interpretation is that Billy Hope's consciousness, even in death, influenced the Walrider's behavior. Billy had been victimized by Murkoff, subjected to procedures that destroyed his body and trapped his mind in permanent, lucid dream state. The Walrider might have inherited Billy's rage at his victimizers and his sympathy for other victims. This would explain why it attacked Murkoff personnel but spared Waylon, who'd also been victimized by the corporation. Another interpretation is that the Walrider developed autonomous consciousness separate from Billy's influence. Years of existing as distributed intelligence might have created something genuinely novel, not quite artificial intelligence, but not quite human consciousness either, an emergent property of billions of nanomachines coordinating their actions in ways that produced higher-level awareness. If this was true, the Walrider's choices reflected its own ethical framework rather than inherited human morality. A darker interpretation is that the Walrider spared Waylon specifically to ensure evidence of Mount Massive's atrocities reached the outside world. It needed Waylon alive to carry Miles's camera, to testify about what happened, to create conditions where Murkoff Corporation would be exposed and destroyed. The Walrider wasn't being merciful, it was being strategic, using Waylon as instrument for revenge against the institution that created it. None of these interpretations are confirmed by the game. The Walrider remains ambiguous, its motivations and nature deliberately unclear. But this ambiguity is thematically appropriate. The horror of the Walrider isn't just that it exists, but that its existence raises questions about consciousness, autonomy, and moral responsibility that human frameworks aren't adequate to answer. If the Walrider is conscious, if it can make ethical choices, then what responsibilities do its creators bear for what it does? If it kills someone, is that murder or is it more like natural disaster, tragic but not criminal? If it shows mercy, does that mercy mean anything, or is it just programmed behavior that resembles human compassion without actually being compassionate? These questions extend beyond the Walrider to broader concerns about creating intelligence, whether artificial or engineered from human consciousness, that might have capacities and motivations we can't fully understand or control. The morphogenic engine didn't just torture Billy Hope, it created something new, something that exists in category between person and weapon, between victim and threat, and that creation is still out there. The game ends with Waylon escaping, but the Walrider's story doesn't end. It continues existing somewhere, doing something, pursuing purposes that remain unknown. This unresolved thread is intentional, a reminder that institutional evil's consequences extend beyond immediate victims, creating effects that ripple outward in ways that can't be fully contained or controlled. Waylon Park survived Mount Massive. He escaped with evidence that damaged Murkoff Corporation. But he didn't stop the Walrider, didn't undo the years of experimentation that created it, and didn't prevent the possibility that whatever the Walrider has become might emerge again in circumstances that create new victims. This is the final horror of Outlast Whistleblower, the recognition that exposing institutional evil doesn't erase its consequences, that the damage has already been done, and that the things created by that damage continue existing in the world regardless of whether the institutions that created them are held accountable. Chapter 11, What Remains? Waylon Park's story doesn't have a conventional ending because trauma doesn't end. It transforms into something you carry, something that shapes how you navigate the world but which doesn't entirely define you. He returned to his family. He provided testimony that contributed to justice, incomplete and inadequate as that justice was. He survived when many others didn't. These are real accomplishments. evidence that individual moral action matters even in contexts where institutional power seems overwhelming. But he also carries permanent psychological damage from what he experienced. He lives with knowledge of atrocities that most people prefer to forget. He understands that institutions designed to protect vulnerable people can become mechanisms for exploiting them, and that this transformation happens through gradual compromises rather than sudden corruption. This knowledge isolates him. People who haven't experienced institutional betrayal struggle to understand why someone would risk everything to expose wrongdoing, why someone wouldn't just accept that reporting through official channels is sufficient, why someone would choose moral principle over practical safety. They view Waylon's choices as excessive or naive, unable to recognize that sometimes official channels are part of the problem rather than the solution. The other survivors understand, but there aren't many of them, and they carry their own trauma. Building community around shared suffering helps, but also risks creating insularity, defining yourselves entirely through what was done to you rather than building identities beyond victimhood. Waylon navigates this tension imperfectly. Some days he manages to live in the present, focusing on his family and work and normal concerns. Other days he's still in Mount Massive, still running through corridors that smell of blood and rot, still hearing variant footsteps behind him. The boundary between past and present becomes permeable, trauma asserting itself regardless of how much time has passed or how much therapy he's completed. This is realistic portrayal of complex PTSD. Recovery isn't linear progression toward being fixed. It's learning to function despite carrying permanent damage, developing skills for managing symptoms when they emerge, and accepting that some things can't be undone or forgotten. The game's achievement is presenting this honestly. Waylon escapes, but escape isn't the same as victory. He survives, but survival comes with costs that continue accumulating long after immediate danger has passed. He exposes Murkoff's crimes, but exposure produces partial consequences that feel inadequate compared to the magnitude of what was done. This refusal of conventional resolution makes Outlast Whistleblower's horror more disturbing than simple monster stories. Monsters can be defeated. Institutions are more resilient, more capable of absorbing damage and reconstituting themselves, more adept at avoiding accountability through legal mechanisms and public relations strategies. Mount Massive Asylum burned, but the dynamics that allowed it to exist remain. Murkoff Corporation dissolved, but corporations with identical business models continue operating. The specific people responsible face some consequences, but the system that enabled them weren't meaningfully reformed. Understanding this is essential to understanding what the game reveals about institutional horror, that individual evil can be punished while systemic evil persists, and that exposing specific atrocities doesn't prevent future atrocities from occurring. Waylon's whistleblowing mattered. It saved no one at Mount Massive, but potentially prevented future victims at facilities Murkoff was planning. It exposed crimes that might otherwise have remained hidden. It demonstrated that individuals can resist institutional evil even when resistance seems futile. These accomplishments are real and important, but they're also limited. The world didn't fundamentally change because of what Waylon exposed. Vulnerable populations remain vulnerable. Institutional oversight remains inadequate. The next Mount Massive might be operating right now, and we wouldn't know until another whistleblower risks everything to expose it. Living with this knowledge that your greatest moral achievement was necessary but insufficient is the burden Waylon carries. Not guilt for what he did, but recognition that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee proportional results, that morality and effectiveness don't always align. and that sometimes you sacrifice everything for partial victory that feels more like defeat. The game doesn't resolve this tension because it can't be resolved. It's simply the reality of confronting institutional evil as an individual. You do what conscience requires, you accept the consequences, and you live with the knowledge that you did something rather than nothing, even though something still feels inadequate compared to what was needed. Chapter 12: The Lore's Implications. Outlast Whistleblower functions as companion to the original Outlast, showing events from a different perspective and revealing information that recontextualizes the main game's narrative. Miles Upshur arrived at Mount Massive because of Waylon's email. His investigation uncovered crimes that Waylon had documented. His death, destroying the morphogenic engine, created conditions that allowed Waylon to escape. The two characters' stories are interdependent, each making the other's actions meaningful. This structure reveals something important about how resistance to institutional evil works. It's rarely individual heroes acting alone, but rather networks of people who contribute different capacities. Documentation, investigation, testimony, direct action. Waylon provided initial evidence. Miles provided journalistic investigation and documentation. Both paid enormous costs. Neither achieved complete victory alone, but together their actions damaged Murkoff enough to prevent the corporation from continuing as it had been. The game also reveals information about Mount Massive's broader context within Murkoff Corporation's operations. The asylum wasn't an isolated facility, but part of a larger network of research installations conducting related experiments. References and documents suggest Murkoff had other locations where similar work was happening, other psychiatric facilities where the morphogenic engine or equivalent technologies were being developed and tested. This implies that Mount Massive's exposure, while significant, didn't end Murkoff's activities entirely. The corporation dissolved, but its research didn't disappear. The knowledge accumulated through decades of human experimentation became intellectual property that could be transferred to successor organizations or sold to governments interested in consciousness manipulation and psychological warfare applications. The variants who escaped Mount Massive represent ongoing threat, but more importantly, they represent ongoing evidence of what was done there. Every person whose mind was deliberately broken by the morphogenic engine carries proof of institutional cruelty in their own neurology. They're living documentation of crimes that can't be fully erased because the damage persists in human beings who continue existing in the world. This creates moral complexity about how to respond to variants. They're dangerous. Their psychological conditions make them capable of violence that threatens public safety, but they're also victims, people who were deliberately destroyed by procedures that should never have been conducted. Treating them only as threats denies their victimization. Treating them only as victims ignores the danger they represent to others. The appropriate response requires holding both realities simultaneously, which institutions struggle to do because bureaucratic categories demand simplification. The Walrider represents a different category of threat and victim. It's not human, though it incorporates Billy Hope's consciousness. It's not exactly artificial intelligence, though it demonstrates autonomous decision-making. It exists in a category that human ethical and legal frameworks aren't designed to address. And it continues existing after Mount Massive's destruction, purpose and intentions unknown, capacity for harm demonstrated, but capacity for mercy also demonstrated. Understanding what the Walrider is and what it might do requires grappling with questions about consciousness, autonomy, and moral responsibility that we usually avoid. If you create intelligence that can suffer and make choices, Do you bear responsibility for what that intelligence does? If you torture that intelligence into existence through procedures that destroy the human consciousness it incorporated, does that intelligence have legitimate grievance? If it seeks revenge against its creators, is that revenge justice or simply violence? These questions don't have obvious answers. The game presents them through horror narrative rather than philosophical essay. But the questions remain serious ones that extend beyond fictional context. As humans develop technologies that might produce new forms of consciousness, whether through artificial intelligence, brain-computer interfaces, or biotechnology that modifies human neurology, we'll face versions of these questions in practical contexts where getting the answers wrong produces real suffering. Outlast Whistleblower uses psychiatric horror to explore these themes, but the themes aren't limited to psychiatric contexts. They apply to any institution with power over captive or vulnerable populations, prisons, schools, military organizations, corporations. Anywhere that institutional authority exceeds accountability, the dynamics Mount Massive demonstrated can emerge. People with good intentions convince themselves that harmful actions serve legitimate purposes. Institutional hierarchies distribute responsibility so widely that no one feels fully accountable. Victims' complaints are dismissed because the institution's legitimacy is assumed. And by the time abuses become undeniable, so much harm has accumulated that accountability feels impossible. This is why the game's horror feels relevant beyond entertainment value. It's diagnosing patterns that exist throughout society, showing how ordinary, institutional dynamics can produce extraordinary cruelty when unchecked. Understanding these patterns doesn't prevent their recurrence, but it does create capacity for recognizing warning signs. Moments when institutional logic starts prioritizing self-preservation over the welfare of people it claims to serve. Waylon recognized those warning signs when he found evidence of Murkoff's experiments. His decision to act on that recognition, to prioritize moral obligation over personal safety, is presented as correct choice that cost him nearly everything. The game doesn't suggest this calculus is easy or that most people should be expected to make similar choices, but it does suggest that institutions rely on people not making those choices, and that their power depends on individuals deciding that personal safety matters more than collective responsibility. The whistleblower disrupts that calculation by prioritizing moral obligation over personal welfare, by refusing to accept institutional legitimacy claims at face value, by insisting that suffering matters even when it happens to people society has decided don't matter. The whistleblower creates conditions where institutional power can be challenged. The challenge often fails or succeeds only partially. The whistleblower usually suffers consequences far exceeding whatever they accomplish, but the alternative is accepting that institutional evil should go unopposed because opposition is costly. Outlast Whistleblower argues that opposition matters despite cost, that documentation and testimony matter even when they produce incomplete justice, that individual moral action matters even when institutional power seems overwhelming, and that carrying evidence of atrocity into the world, even when that evidence doesn't produce the accountability it should, is meaningful work that justifies the sacrifice it requires. This is ultimately what Waylon Park's story demonstrates, not that whistleblowing produces happy endings, or that moral action guarantees proportional reward, but that doing what conscience requires, accepting the consequences, and continuing to insist that institutional evil should be exposed and opposed. These actions matter even when their effects are limited and their costs are catastrophic. The lore of Outlast. Whistleblower is the lore of institutional horror and individual resistance, of systems that destroy vulnerable people and the people who refuse to accept that destruction as inevitable, of partial victories that feel like defeat, but which prevent future atrocities from remaining completely hidden. Its horror grounded in historical reality, using fictional extremity to illuminate patterns that exist throughout institutional life. And it's a reminder that every institution's legitimacy is granted by people who choose to recognize it, that authority without accountability becomes tyranny regardless of stated purposes, and that individuals who challenge institutional power by insisting on moral principles over practical compliance create possibilities for change that wouldn't otherwise exist. Waylon Park paid an enormous price for his whistleblowing, but his story demonstrates that the price of silence is higher, not for the individual who stays silent, but for everyone who suffers institutional abuse because no one was willing to expose it. This calculus doesn't make whistleblowing easy or expect that most people should risk what Waylon risked, but it does suggest that societies need people willing to make that choice, and that honoring their sacrifice means actually reforming the institutions they expose, rather than simply moving on to the next scandal. Epilogue, the story that never ends. The final element of Outlast Whistleblower that deserves attention is what it doesn't show, the continuation of consequences beyond Waylon's escape, the long-term effects of Mount Massive's experiments that ripple through society in ways that can't be fully tracked or contained. Somewhere variants who escaped are living among general population trying to manage psychological conditions that were deliberately inflicted on them. They're homeless or institutionalized, or perhaps functioning marginally in jobs that don't require them to interact with people extensively. They carry trauma that no therapist fully understands because their conditions aren't naturally occurring mental illness, but artificially created damage from procedures that shouldn't exist. They're living evidence of Murkoff's crimes, but evidence that's dispersed and fragmented and unlikely to be recognized as connected to Mount Massive. Somewhere, Murkoff's research continues under different names and different institutional frameworks. The knowledge accumulated through decades of human experimentation didn't disappear when the corporation dissolved. It exists in databases and documents, and in the minds of researchers who worked on the morphogenic engine. That knowledge might be used for legitimate purposes, understanding consciousness, developing treatments for psychiatric conditions, advancing neuroscience, or it might be weaponized again, applied to new populations and facilities that learned from Mount Massive's mistakes about how to avoid exposure. Somewhere, the Walrider exists. It might be dormant, dispersed into components too small and numerous to detect. It might be active, pursuing purposes that humans can't understand. It might be dead, whatever consciousness it possessed having dissipated when it lost connection to Billy Hope. The game doesn't resolve this question, leaving open the possibility that Murkoff's most dangerous creation continues existing in forms and locations unknown. And everywhere the dynamics that allowed Mount Massive to exist continue operating. Psychiatric patients remain vulnerable populations whose complaints are routinely dismissed. Institutional oversight remains inadequate to prevent abuses when institutions are determined to commit them. Corporations continue having resources that exceed government regulatory capacity. Whistleblowers continue facing retaliation that makes reporting institutional wrongdoing dangerous enough that most people rationally choose silence. Outlast Whistleblower doesn't pretend that exposing one atrocity solves these systemic issues. It doesn't suggest that Waylon's sacrifice or Miles's death fundamentally changed the world. What it suggests is that resistance matters despite its limitations, that exposing institutional evil has value even when consequences are inadequate, and that individuals who choose moral principle over practical safety create possibilities that wouldn't otherwise exist. The story never truly ends because institutional horror is ongoing. Mount Massive is gone, but the patterns it exemplified persist. Understanding those patterns, recognizing them when they emerge, and being willing to resist despite cost, these capacities matter more than individual outcomes. Waylon's story is one instance of resistance. There will be others. Some will succeed more completely, others will fail more catastrophically. But collectively, they create conditions where institutional power faces challenges that limit its capacity for unchecked abuse. This is the final implication of Outlast Whistleblower's lore, that horror isn't just entertainment but diagnosis, that understanding how institutions enable atrocity creates capacity to recognize and resist similar patterns, and that every person who refuses to accept institutional evil as inevitable contributes to collective resistance that might, gradually and incompletely, create accountability where none existed before. Waylon Park is still alive, still carrying evidence, still testifying when asked. His nightmare didn't end with his escape, but it continues in forms he can manage, with support from people who understand, with purpose derived from knowing that his suffering wasn't meaningless. He paid a price, but that price purchased something partial: justice, limited prevention of future harm, and demonstration that individuals can resist institutional power even when resistance seems futile. The lore of Outlast Whistleblower is ultimately the lore of that resistance, costly, incomplete, necessary, and ongoing,